Sexual exploitation of children was so rife, it became the norm.
Infamous for years of child abuse.
Sexual exploitation has become a fact of life.
They trafficked, raped or sexually abused girls.
They were stories of the most horrific abuse. Rape, violence, exploitation, perpetrated against children on an almost industrial scale. Horror at the crimes, matched by outrage at the persistent failures of police and the authorities. Lessons would be learnt, of course, and yet still today, damning evidence of yet more failure. At the inquiry, she was known as witness CSA12. But Fiona Goddard has waived her anonymity to speak about 5 long years of rape and abuse and the many opportunities missed.
Most of it's just a blur of being abused and beaten and fighting. When I think back to it, there were a lot of times stood at my window crying, wondering how I could get away and trying to take my own life as well. That became a regular thing back when I was about 15, 16.
And the men just came for you every day?
Near enough every day, about at least 6 days a week, yeah. If you said no, you got beaten up, or you got taken out to the middle of the moors and dumped in the moors and stuff.
She says care home staff and police were well aware she was being exploited. And then when a child is clearly being abused and may say that she's being abused and nothing is done, what does that do to that child?
It crushes you. It makes you feel completely alone, and it makes you believe that you are the wrong person. You have to be prosecuting them and you have to be chasing it down to be able to limit the destruction it leaves.
9 men were sentenced to a total of 132 years in jail. Bradford Council, the local authority where she was in care, admitted it had let children down in the past and apologised, adding it had worked hard to improve its response. But just last week, its children's services were put into a trust, in part for its continued failings in relation to child sexual exploitation. Today's report makes clear there are similar concerns across the country. The inquiry highlighted what it called the flawed assumption that sexual exploitation was decreasing, when in reality it had become even more of a hidden problem, with children being sexually exploited in the most degrading and destructive ways, police and local authorities struggling to keep pace and failing even to properly collect specific data on the sex and ethnicity of either victims or perpetrators. The abuse uncovered in Rochdale and Rotherham more than a decade ago was deemed a national scandal. Gangs of men raping children, the authorities effectively turning a blind eye. It was supposed to be a watershed, and yet today's report says children are still being repeatedly raped by networks of men, sometimes for years, and police and local authorities are still failing to properly tackle the problem. And a concern that some authorities are so nervous of being labelled the next Rotherham, they're not even looking.
What I'm reassured of is that up and down and across the country, my colleagues have the child right at the centre of everything they do. We have colleagues that...
The problem is it's not working, is it? We learnt so much with Rotherham and Rochdale about police attitudes to some of these young girls, about not intervening, about turning a blind eye. The problem is today's report says in some instances that still seems to be happening.
It does, and we acknowledge that. It's not good enough where that happens, and it says in some instances, in thousands of cases, up and down the country, there is a caring, compassionate police service that listens to victims, that supports victims, that helps them in the most distressing of circumstances.
The notion any town or city is immune to child sexual exploitation is dispelled by this inquiry. It urges authorities everywhere not to be complacent. For the former detective who exposed the scale and failings around grooming in Rochdale, too little is changing.
Lack of data collection, lack of recording of ethnicity, institutional hesitancy to intervene, and missing from homes not being dealt with properly, criminalisation of victims. So all these things are highlighted, and we are dealing with current cases every single day, and they are very similar to the ones that I was dealing with 15 years ago, and the problems are still the same. The victims are being blamed. The organisations that are responsible for child protection continue to cover up and try to conceal their failures, and that hasn't gone away, and it won't unless action is taken.
So among the practical recommendations, improving data and stronger sentencing, a call to put victims at the heart of everything. The victims, of course, have heard that before.
Jackie Long with that report. And if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in her report, you can find more information on the Channel 4 website.